Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Georgiana Lovering was born in 1858 in Connecticut to Joseph Lovering and Mary Day. Her early childhood was marked by the turbulence of the Civil War, which raged between 1861 and 1865. Her father Joseph served as a soldier in the 5th New Hampshire Regiment, enduring the hardships of battle. When the war ended, he returned home, but was quite sick, and soon after he died. The loss was a devastating blow to Georgiana and her mother, who were already struggling with limited means. They relied on a modest government pension and the small amount of income that Mary managed to earn from working as often as she was able. They lived in a small cottage, about 2 miles from the village of Northwood. Though Georgiana was an only child, the house was far from lonely. It was owned by her grandparents, who also lived there, as did her 18-year-old cousin named Adeline Witham. Georgiana attended the local school, where she was a favourite among her teachers. She was bright and pretty, and was also well known within the local community. Whenever she ran errands for her mother, she would greet everyone she passed with a friendly smile, which left a good impression on all who knew her. In June 1872, Georgiana's great-uncle came to live with them, a man named Franklin Evans. He was 64 years old, and a somewhat strange character. He had grown up in New Hampshire, but had lived a restless life, moving from place to place. Over the years, he had spent time in several towns across the states, including Manchester, Concord, Allenstown, Derry, and Candia. He had been married 3 times. His first wife had died after 20 years of marriage, and they had 2 children together, a son who by 1872 was living in Derry in New Hampshire, and a daughter who lived in Lawrence in Massachusetts. After his wife's death, he remarried, but his second wife left him. Though he married for a 3rd time, that union also ended when his wife left him. People usually perceived Franklin Evans as a cunning man, known for his peculiar yet seemingly harmless ways. He reinvented himself frequently, claiming to be a botanist, a magician, and even a self-styled preacher of the Second Advent. His travels took him across many states, and also into Canada. But wherever he went, his deceptions were soon uncovered, and his reputation as a fraud followed him. But now in his 60s, he had started to settle down to a simpler routine, earning a living working for local farmers, and trying to blend into the quiet rhythm of rural life. By June 1872, he had found lodging at the home of his sister Deborah and her husband Mr. Sylvester Day, the grandparents of Georgiana Lovering. It was a strange arrangement, as 6 people were now living in the small house, but it seemed that everyone got along. Franklin Evans had always shown great fondness for Georgiana, but this affection took a darker turn when he made inappropriate advances towards her, which she firmly rejected. After that, he started to keep his distance from the child. That summer, he began setting up bird snares in the woods, beyond the pasture in front of their house. This made Georgiana quite curious, and she asked if she could go with him. He agreed, and she did so on several occasions. However, she eventually lost interest and did not accompany him anymore. That was until the evening of Thursday the 24th of October 1872, when Franklin Evans told his great-niece that he would be leaving early for work in the morning and asked if she would check the bird snares before she went to school. She hesitated, but after some persuasion, she reluctantly agreed. Friday dawned bright and clear, and Mr. Evans headed off to work. Around 8 o'clock, Georgiana was eating breakfast, but her grandmother noticed an unusual seriousness about her and asked her what was wrong. The young girl replied that although she had promised her uncle that she would check the snares, she did not like doing it, as when alone, she found the area a rough and lonely place. However, she kissed her mother and grandmother goodbye, crossed the road, and went off towards the woods. Whenever Georgiana went there, she was usually gone no longer than 30 or 45 minutes. So when an hour passed, and she had not returned, her mother grew uneasy. At first, she reassured herself that there was no real cause for concern, but as the hours dragged on, her unease turned to fear. By mid-morning, the worry had turned into panic, so Georgiana's grandfather set out in search of her. He called her name as he walked the familiar path into the woods, and expected her to emerge from behind the trees at any moment. but she never appeared. He searched different paths, hoping that she had simply taken another way home, yet there was no sign of her. When he returned, he asked the neighbours for help, and soon a search party was formed. As the group walked through the trees, a growing sense of dread took hold. By the afternoon, about half a mile from the house, they discovered a broken comb, which was immediately recognised as belonging to Georgiana, and on closer inspection, strands of her hair clung to it. Not far away, a strong piece of string lay discarded on the ground. A cold wave of horror now passed through those searching for the girl, and they began to suspect that something terrible had happened. Word spread quickly in the village that Georgiana was missing, and soon more than 100 people had started to look for her. Next, her apron was found, and there was discarded earth on the ground nearby, which suggested there had been a struggle. Further ahead there were footprints of different sizes, and evidence that a person had been dragged. By now, it seemed as though everyone feared the worst. Nevertheless, the search pressed on as people scoured the woods, desperate to find any trace of the missing girl. It was soon established that Franklin Evans had not actually gone to work that day. He had been seen by 2 witnesses, one at around 8 a.m. and another at around 9:30 a.m, on both occasions near the woods. The next time he was seen was at 12 p.m. near the village. The witness knew it was noon, as he said that Mr. Evans had stopped him to ask for the time. However, when the witness was asked if Mr. Evans had shown any signs of distress, the witness said that he had not. Mr. Evans was seen shortly afterwards at a store, and the storekeeper said that he appeared completely normal. When Mr. Evans had returned home on the Friday afternoon, a local man named John Mead, who had an appointment with Mrs. Lovering to discuss her pension, spoke with him about the missing girl. Mr. Evans was calm and said that he had no idea where she might have gone. However, people were now starting to wonder if Franklin Evans may be hiding a terrible secret, one that tied him directly to the young girl's disappearance. The following day, a warrant was issued for his arrest on the charge of murder. By now, Georgiana had been missing for more than 30 hours. Sheriff Henry Drew went to Mr. Day's house to serve the warrant, but first he questioned Mr. Evans about the disappearance. He firmly denied any knowledge of Georgiana's whereabouts, and strangely, he added that he was as innocent as an angel in heaven. Despite his insistence, the sheriff proceeded with the arrest, and Mr. Evans did not resist. He was then taken to the sheriff's house in Stratford, which was about 2 miles away. While travelling there, he spoke freely about the case. He insisted that the girl was alive, and said that he would never harm her. He described Georgiana as an innocent child, who he cared for deeply. However, despite his words, he begged the sheriff for some strychnine. Later, while having dinner at a hotel, he asked the waitress, a young lady named Miss Brown, if she could put poison in his tea. The next day, Sunday the 27th of October, a heavy storm swept over the village. Despite the dreadful weather, 250 people continued to search for Georgiana, but their efforts were in vain, and there was still no sign of the girl. As time passed, the public suspicion grew. Many began to believe that Georgiana Lovering had met a tragic fate, likely at the hands of Franklin Evans. On Tuesday afternoon, Sheriff Henry Drew confronted him. He offered him a chance to come forward with the truth and assured him that if Georgiana was alive and he revealed her whereabouts, he would not be harmed by the authorities or anyone else. After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Evans claimed that the girl was indeed alive. He told the sheriff that a few days earlier, while in Stratford, he had met a man named Aaron Webster, who came from Kingston. He said the two of them struck a deal. He would escort Georgiana through the woods to a predetermined meeting spot on Friday the 25th of October, where Mr. Webster would be waiting to take her into his care and transport her to an undisclosed location. Mr. Evans went on to say that the day before he had given the girl $11 to buy clothes, and on the Friday he escorted her to the designated spot. He claimed that they found Mr. Webster waiting with a suitcase of additional clothing, and after Georgiana had changed into a new outfit, she left with the man. He delivered his story with such confidence and detail that there were those who thought that it may be a true account of what had happened. Sheriff Drew, however, remained sceptical, but he decided that it warranted investigation. The townspeople, many of whom still harboured some level of trust in Mr. Evans, stopped the search, hoping that Georgiana might indeed be safe. The following morning, Sheriff Drew took Mr. Evans to Kingston to verify his story. He searched the town thoroughly, questioning residents and looking for any sign of the man named Aaron Webster. Unfortunately, no one had ever heard of him. Undeterred, Mr. Evans then suggested that the man might actually be from Kensington. The next day they travelled there, but once again, no trace of the elusive Mr. Webster could be found. As a last attempt to keep his tale alive, Mr. Evans claimed that Mr. Webster may actually have been from Candia, but Sheriff Drew had been doubtful of this story from the start, and any lingering faith that it might be true had completely vanished, so he put an end to the search. Instead, he brought Franklin Evans back to Stratford. After the journeys to Kingston and Kensington, Sheriff Drew was convinced that Mr. Evans knew the truth as to whether the young girl was alive or dead. Determined to get an answer, he decided to confront him directly. He began by speaking of the child's innocence, the discovery of her apron, and the broken comb entangled with strands of her hair. The sheriff then leaned forwards, and looking straight at Mr. Evans, he asked, "In the presence of no one but us, and the great being above, is the girl's body cold in death?" There was an eerie silence. The only sounds were the steady ticking of the clock and the faint rhythm of their own restrained breathing. For several tense seconds neither man moved. Then Mr. Evans' composure cracked. His face turned pale, his hands trembled, and with a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It is Mr. Drew. I have done wrong." Without hesitation, the sheriff responded with the same calm authority he had maintained throughout, and said, "Go with me and show me where she is." Mr. Evans then nodded. Following a few more moments of silence, and probably frightened of being carried off by a lynch mob, he asked the sheriff if he could rely on him for protection, to which Sheriff Drew replied that they would do whatever had been agreed upon. He then reminded Franklin Evans that he would not be able to escape the reality of what he had done. Immediately preparations were made to recover the body. Sheriff Drew went to his wife's bedroom and informed her that he was leaving with Mr. Evans, and asked her to go to the home of a neighbour named Alonzo Tuttle and instruct him to fetch Mr. E.J. Parshley, as the two men were needed to meet him in the woods where the girl had disappeared. Then, without delay, the sheriff and his prisoner departed, travelling by horse-drawn carriage, and arriving at the edge of the woods around midnight. Sheriff Drew handed the lantern to Mr. Evans and asked him to lead the way. They passed the spot where the apron had been found and crossed the fence where the broken comb had been discovered. They continued into an area that was full of stones, fallen trees, and wet grass, which made walking very difficult. More than once they stumbled and fell, and their clothes became damp and muddy. Suddenly Mr. Evans hesitated. He looked around and said that he had lost his way. He then suggested they return to the fence and try again. Retracing their steps over the same grueling path, they reached the fence once more. Mr. Evans studied the area carefully, before, without a word, turning back into the trees. The journey was no easier the second time. By now, both men were soaked and covered in mud. After what felt like an eternity, they entered a bleak, desolate hollow, littered with twisted roots and jagged stones. A big tree had fallen there, its roots having torn up a great mound of earth. Mr. Evans came to a halt and said, "There." He then knelt down and removed some leaves, and as Sheriff Drew looked on, he saw the body of a child. Without a word, the sheriff pulled a pair of handcuffs from his pockets and put them on Mr. Evans, who was by now overcome with despair. The sheriff then called over to the other men and told one to stay behind to guard the prisoner and the other to go with him to summon law enforcement and a surgeon. Hours later they returned. At first light, the men carefully lifted Georgiana's body from its shallow grave. Her face was eerily serene, with only 2 faint abrasions, but the truth of her fate was unmistakable. Bruises on her neck revealed an imprint of fingers, undeniable evidence that she had been strangled. Her dress was bunched up towards her shoulders, the fabric torn and muddied from what appeared to be a cruel dragging through the swamp. As the grim reality settled over the scene, Mr. Franklin Evans remained silent. It was as if his mind was clouded with guilt and desperation. Sheriff Drew managed to construct a makeshift stretcher and, along with the other men, began making his way out of the woods. However, as the body was lifted, the gruesome spectacle grew even worse, affecting everyone present. Each person turned pale, and when the body passed Franklin Evans, he let out a shriek of anguish that echoed loudly through the trees. The journey back was slow and arduous, but by the afternoon, Sheriff Drew finally arrived in the village, bringing Georgiana's body with him. The discovery had already begun to spread, and a crowd gathered as the weight of the tragedy settled over the community. By 4:30, an inquest was officially convened to examine the circumstances of the death. It was revealed that not only had the poor child been strangled, she had also been mutilated, and some of her organs had been buried in a different part of the woods. The inquest was told that since the previous June, Mr. Evans had been living at Mr. Day's house, and that his relationship with the family members was generally peaceful, and that those who knew him did not consider him to be a dangerous man. He was 64 years old, of medium build, slim, with a slight stoop. He had a long grey beard and long grey hair, a thin face, and was of average height. Witnesses said that his appearance was usually reasonably neat, but he was a smooth talker and a keen observer, and always seemed to have a pious look, which some said seemed to make him look like a cunning, shrewd and unprincipled man. The inquest concluded that he had murdered Georgiana Lovering, and Franklin Evans was remanded in custody to await his trial. Over the next few months, Mr. Evans insisted that he was innocent, claiming that it was a man known to him as Webster who had killed the girl and paid him to help conceal the body. His story was dismissed, and authorities began to wonder if he had been responsible for a series of brutal unsolved murders that had spanned more than 2 decades. In 1850, a 5-year-old girl had been abducted and presumed murdered in the town of Derry in New Hampshire, but no body had ever been recovered. 12 years later, a 9-year-old girl named Laura Libby from the town of Strong in Maine was attacked and murdered. A man named Lawrence Doyle, who was originally from Ireland and who at the time was working for the girl's father, was charged with the crime. After 2 trials, he was convicted and sentenced to death. A stay of execution was granted, and in 1869, when new evidence emerged, he was awarded a new trial. Sadly, he died in prison in 1870, before he had the chance to have his conviction overturned. In 1865, brother and sister Isabella and John Joyce were murdered in Bussey Woods in Roxbury, in Massachusetts. Isabella was brutally stabbed after being assaulted, while John, frozen in terror, was also killed. It was noted that Mr. Evans was in Boston at the time, delivering one of his religious lectures. In 1872, a woman's body was found near the woods in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. She had also been murdered. All of these unsolved cases were now being linked to Franklin Evans. However, despite the growing list of suspected crimes, it was decided that he would only be tried for the murder of Georgiana Lovering. His trial began on the 3rd of February 1873 and was presided over by Justice Stowe and Justice Ladd. It became a media sensation, capturing the public's attention with its shocking details and grisly nature. Newspapers eagerly reported every development, which fueled widespread fascination and debate. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager for updates on the case that had gripped the community. However, many were left disappointed when the proceedings lasted only 2 days. Mr. Evans had already confessed his guilt to Sheriff Drew and had led him to the body. On the final day, he attempted to hang himself in his cell, but was stopped by a guard. He was then shackled and returned to court, but this gave the defence the opportunity to argue that their client was actually insane, claiming that his actions had been driven by some form of madness. The defence painted a picture of a man overcome by delusions, hoping to sway the jury with the notion that he was incapable of understanding the severity of his crime. The prosecution psychiatrist, however, firmly countered these claims and provided evidence that the defendant was fully aware of his actions and had shown no signs of insanity. He testified that the defendant's behaviour was consistent with someone acting with full mental clarity, which undermined the defence's arguments. When the jury was sent out to deliberate, they did so for just 30 minutes, before returning with a guilty verdict. Franklin Evans was then sentenced to hang. While awaiting his execution, he was visited by an attorney named E.F. Pillsbury, who had been sent by the governor to question him about the 1862 murder of Laura Libby. Mr. Evans denied any involvement, insisting that he had never known the girl or her family. However, this claim was contradicted by a witness, who testified that the girl's parents attended the same church as Mr. Evans, and that he had dined with them on several occasions at their home. Days later, Sheriff Drew questioned him about the 1865 Joyce killings. This time, he vaguely suggested that he might have been responsible, but gave no direct confession. As his execution neared, he had vivid dreams and visions, which some newspapers linked to all of the unsolved crimes. Yet he remained in good spirits, convinced that he would be pardoned. He said that his only regret was that he had not fully committed to preaching his faith. Franklin Evans was not pardoned, and as his execution date neared, he wrote a confession admitting to the murders of Georgiana Lovering and the 5-year-old Mills child. He said that in the autumn of 1850, when he was living in Salem, he had travelled to Derry and stumbled upon the home of Mr. Mills. He said that there he found a sickly child, and believing that it was unlikely that she would survive the night, he took her to the woods for surgical purposes, but due to her poorly condition and overcome with guilt, he strangled her and buried her beneath a chestnut tree stump. He said that he later returned to the area, but was unable to find the place where he had buried the little girl. He also admitted to theft and fraud, but denied any other murders. He requested that following his execution, his body be sold to Dartmouth College's medical division, with the proceedings going to his son. On the 18th of February 1874, Franklin Evans read his confession aloud and bid farewell to his children. He was then hanged. That evening his body was delivered to Dartmouth, where Dr. A.H. Crosby performed the dissection as Mr. Evans had wished. His confession was printed in full in the newspapers across the region. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.